Hi, I'm Cautex, and recently I got a comment from a viewer named Terracus asking me to do some analysis comparing Sweeping Strikes and Bladestorm. Specifically, they noticed that in Mythic Plus on pulls with 4 to 5 targets, sometimes it felt like they would do more damage with Sweeping Strikes than with Bladestorm. This seemed interesting to me, so I had a look. Long story short, Terracus was exactly right. Sometimes it is in fact possible for Sweeping Strikes to beat Bladestorm when there are 4 to 5 targets. Also, it turns out that Mortal Combo doesn't work the way you might expect, causing it to have an interesting interaction with Sweeping Strikes. So, before I get into the math, I gotta talk about that first because it does impact our DPS and how I went about modeling the damage of Sweeping Strikes. So currently a max rank and empowered Mortal Combo has a 20% chance to proc. While I was playing around with Sweeping Strikes at the training dummies to see if I can empirically replicate the outcomes mentioned by Terracus, I noticed that I seem to be getting a relatively high number of Mortal Combo procs, which would show up as 4 hits of Mortal Strike in the combat log. So I started keeping track of how many Mortal Combo procs I would get over the course of each Sweeping Strike's usage. After doing about 200 Mortal Strikes this way, the proc rate that I observed was 37.1%, which is obviously way above the 20% that is stated on the tooltip. Prior to this observation, I was under the impression that how Mortal Combo interacted with Sweeping Strikes was that the cleaved Mortal Strike did not count as being cast, and therefore could not proc Mortal Combo. That impression was definitely wrong here. How it actually seems to work is that Mortal Combo can proc off of any instance of Mortal Strikes that occur, but to mitigate Mortal Combo proccing off of itself, it has a 3-second internal cooldown. What this means is that when you're using Sweeping Strikes, Mortal Combo has 2 rolls of that 20% proc chance, but because of the internal cooldown, you could not get a double proc. Mathematically, you can determine the proc rate here by answering the question, what's the probability of getting at least 1 proc? To get that answer, you would find the probability of getting no proc twice, so 80% times 80%, which in this case is 64%. You would then invert that by taking 100% minus that 64%, which would give us a proc rate of 36%, which is right in line with what I observed. So basically, Mortal Combo has a higher chance to proc when hitting multiple targets with Sweeping Strikes because that extra hit can proc Mortal Combo. This means that when I'm comparing Sweeping Strike's damage to Bladestorm damage, I should be calculating the damage done by Mortal Strike using a 36% chance of proccing Mortal Combo and not 20%. So with that out of the way, now we can actually start doing the comparison of Sweeping Strikes to Bladestorm. How I chose to make this comparison is by starting from the perspective that if you just used all of your other cooldowns, and let's assume that Sweeping Strikes is active, basically you need to decide which you think is going to do more damage, a Bladestorm or spending a Bladestorm duration's worth of GCDs using single target abilities. Now, the duration of Bladestorm gets reduced by haste, but so does the GCD duration. These two things scale proportionally, and because of that, as long as you have under 100% haste, Bladestorm will always last for 4 global cooldowns. Meaning that our question becomes, what does more damage, Bladestorm or 4 GCDs worth of abilities that would get cleaved by Sweeping Strikes? And of course, we want to be able to answer this question for any given number of targets. So I started out by calculating the damage of Bladestorm based off of its damage formula and my current gear. The next thing that I had to do was implement the soft cap damage scaling that was implemented in 9.1.5. Below the soft cap, you can simply calculate the damage of an ability in AoE by calculating the damage it does to one target and then multiplying by the number of targets present. Once you hit that soft cap, you need to implement a new multiplier. So you would still calculate the damage it does to one target and then multiply it by the number of targets present, but you would also take all of that and then multiply it by the square root of the target cap divided by the number of targets. So for example, if there are 8 targets, you would multiply everything by the square root of the target cap, which for Bladestorm is 8, divided by 8, which simplifies to multiplying by the square root of 1, which is of course 1. So at 8 targets, there is no damage reduction. Now, if there are 10 targets, then you would be multiplying by the square root of 8 divided by 10, or the square root of 0.8, which is approximately 0.89. The next thing that I needed to account for was deep wounds. To do this, because I was already overestimating the value of Sweeping Strikes by not having to account for the fact that it's on the global cooldown and I would be using it, I made the decision to calculate deep wounds damage in a way that would likely be inflated when compared to reality. Specifically, I calculated the tick rate and also the tick damage of deep wounds, and then calculated how many ticks I would get during a Bladestorm, which in my case was 2. I then added the damage of those 2 ticks to the damage of a full deep wounds, and that is what I would use to calculate the value of a deep wounds per target hit. In reality, most pulls won't have all the mobs live for more than 15 seconds, so you're not going to get all of that value. The next thing that I considered was that because Sweeping Strikes and Mortal Strike allow you to maintain deep wounds on 2 targets, I excluded the damage of 2 of the targets present. This was simply so that I didn't have to try and account for deep wounds on Mortal Strike. While it is technically okay for me to do it in this way, because both sides would have an equal amount of deep wounds benefit from those 2 targets, it is kind of sloppy to do it this way. Though if doing this does introduce any error into the results, it should be fairly minor. Regardless, it is something that's worth keeping in mind when interpreting these results. With all of that done, I had a working calculation for Bladestorm that I could use as a comparison. Now I had to model sweeping strikes. To do this, I looked at a couple of potential scenarios for abilities that could be used during this 4GCD window. The best possible scenario for sweeping strikes would be to use 2 overpowers, then a mortal strike, which would get a tactician proc, allowing you to use overpower a 3rd time. For a middle-of-the-road type scenario, I use the scenario of doing 2 overpowers, a mortal strike, and then a slam. And for the worst-case scenario, I use the scenario of doing an overpower, then a slam, then a mortal strike, and then another slam. Now sure, there are obviously worse scenarios than that, but I wanted to use situations that seemed reasonably possible in the context of a Mythic Plus pull where you'd also be using your other cooldowns. With these scenarios in mind, for the most part, calculating the damage of these abilities was pretty straightforward, though there was still things that I needed to account for. First, I had to account for Mortal Combo. To do this, I calculated a weighted average based off of its proc rate and the impact that it would have. While doing this, I also had to make sure to calculate it based on the fact that Mortal Combo procs don't get the benefit of overpowered stacks. The next thing that I had to account for was Dreadnought. Cleaved overpowers create their own instance of Dreadnought, which does not suffer from the 75% damage multiplier of sweeping strikes. This means that assuming both Dreadnoughts hit all of the targets present, the number of times that Dreadnought will hit will be 2 times the number of targets present. Of course, in reality, it's not always possible to ensure that both Dreadnoughts hit all of the targets, so by doing the calculations this way, it might overvalue sweeping strikes a bit. I also had to account for Dreadnought's target cap, which was 5 as opposed to Bladestorm's cap of 8. Once I accounted for all of these things, I could simply add up the damages done by all those abilities and get a grand total for how much damage would be done during that 4GCD period, based off of the number of targets present. From there, I could simply compare those numbers to the Bladestorm numbers and find which was bigger and where the breakpoints were. Specifically, what I did was I took the sweeping strikes damage and then I subtracted it from the Bladestorm damage. If that number was positive, then it meant that sweeping strikes did more damage with that number of targets, and if the number was negative, it meant that Bladestorm did more damage with that number of targets. After doing that, here's what I found. In the best case scenario for sweeping strikes, which was 2 overpowers, a mortal strike, then another overpower, Bladestorm starts beating sweeping strikes once there are 7 targets present. In the worst case scenario, which was overpower, slam, mortal strike, slam, Bladestorm started beating sweeping strikes once there was 4 targets present. And then in my middle of the ground scenario, which was 2 overpowers, mortal strike, then slam, Bladestorm started beating sweeping strikes once there was 6 targets present. So these results basically confirm exactly what Terracus had observed. Around that 4 to 5 target range, sweeping strikes will frequently be just as good, if not a little bit better than Bladestorm. Now, since I had built this spreadsheet and had it up and running, I figured that I might as well also take a look at Whirlwind, both with and without Merciless Bone Grinder. Now, because I am simply assuming that sweeping strikes is active, I only really need to make this comparison on an ability-by-ability basis, because essentially each GCD you'd be deciding whether or not to Whirlwind or use some other ability. Now, this analysis obviously does not take rage cost into consideration, but purely in terms of damage, while Merciless Bone Grinder is active, Whirlwind beats a sweeping strikes overpower as long as there are 4 or more targets present. Conveniently, this is also the breakpoint for Whirlwind beating a cleaved Mortal Strike, though that is not counting the value provided by Mortal Strike applying deep wounds. So in reality, you'd probably still want to be using Mortal Strike at and above 4 targets occasionally in order to maintain deep wounds. So how should we interpret these results? Well, I think that once you're doing pulls with 6 targets or more, especially if you're running Merciless Bone Grinder, that's the point at which Bladestorm really starts to take over and being the obvious best choice. At 4 to 5 targets, Bladestorm and Sweeping Strikes are about equal, though with good RNG, Sweeping Strikes can beat Bladestorm. At some point, if I'm bored or if there's enough interest, I might do a deep dive on this and calculate a weighted average for Sweeping Strikes based off of the probabilities of all of the potential ability usage scenarios, which would give us an expectation of the average damage that you would do with Sweeping Strikes in this time frame, given this number of targets. Finally, if there are 4 or fewer targets, then you shouldn't really use Bladestorm unless Sweeping Strikes is on cooldown. But as always, tell me why my analysis is garbage, tell me why my opinions are dumb, or suggest ideas of things that you'd like me to analyze. Lastly, I just want to say thank you for watching this video, and subscribe for more.